Right, let's see how this works. Now, one thing that I did is I did notice that the background thing for our class, it looks like to me that it's not working. Everything is working, but one of the videos is not working. So I'm trying to get to that, and I'm gonna see. It's been really odd because I'm teaching two sections of this exact same class, and the sections are supposed to be exact mirrors of each other. And what is really odd is that, like for you guys, most of the photos work and all the quizzes. And um, what I'm noticing is that that is not the case with the other section. And then just right before I got on, I noticed that the photos are all not working on the quiz for this one, for this most recent quiz. And that is just really problematic. Now, did you get in your email, did you get the PDF that I sent out that had the photos for the quiz? Okay, you said yes. All right, good. Okay, excellent. Hopefully that will help. And I'm going to make those for each of the quizzes moving forward until I get this sorted out. What is so aggravating for me is that from my end, it looks like everything's great. And then I find out from several people it's not working for them. Some of them it works okay after a while and then it stops working. So we're gonna try to get it all fixed and taken care of. I really don't understand why it doesn't work. So I did revamp the photos in this quiz this week, and I also included there should be clickable links to the exact photo that I use. So if it doesn't work, you can click on that. If have you Liv, have you already taken the quiz? And if you haven't, or I should ask, have you already taken the quiz? Okay, you haven't yet. All right, if you wouldn't mind, when you take it, would you double check those photos? Let me know if they work now and if the links to those images are clickable. Would you mind, sometime over the next week when you take the quiz to just double check on that and let me know? All right, excellent. Very good. Okay, so what I want to do today is we're going to just do a quick recap of the realistic to non-objective or to abstract really and non-objective. We're going to talk about what the organic kind of component means to this biomorphic abstraction, and we're going to look at a couple examples of what artists have done and just talk about them. And then after that, we're going to look at stuff by previous class so you can see where the artists are at. What kind of stuff they did, what kinds of things should be worked on, and that kind of a thing, so that hopefully that will help quite a bit. And then next week we're going to look at what people have done, talk about it, and work on the grades. I've also gotten a couple people have already turned in their um, their PowerPoints, and we're going to look at those videos as well. And I think that will really help quite a bit. And if you're doing the service learning route, you're working on your project, your service project, rather than working on the PowerPoint or the annotated bibliography. Okay. So the previous session, I had a little bit of a tough time sharing. So we're going to work and make sure that this works out for everybody. All right, Liv, if you can show me with a thumbs up, can you see that page? All right, great. And Kelsey, you're here too. Excellent.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, we are evidently you survived last week, so that's good. We are going to do a quick recap on the spectrum of realism to non-objective and abstraction and stuff like that, and talk about that a little bit. And then we're going to look at previous examples of these biomorphic carvings. So Liv's speaker is not working, and Kelsey, if you want to chime in, that'd be just fine. So this is just going to be a quick few couple minutes of recap. Um, I know that like Chris Thornock is one of the best naturalistic, realistic painters I have ever met. He is fantastic. And if you are a painter and you have an opportunity to take one of his classes, um, I don't know. There are not a lot of things that I wouldn't do to have that opportunity. He is exceptional. So, but we are going the route of um, abstraction. And one thing that really bothers me about abstraction, and I don't know if it's true for you guys, but one thing that really frustrates me is when galleries, 120 years ago, got a hold of abstraction. This actually even started in the 1880s, as people were going into Impressionism, moving away from naturalism. Galleries started generating this kind of idea that, and I don't know how purposeful it was, but this idea that if you collected abstract paintings, things that were not naturalistic, it meant that you were smarter somehow. And rather than taking the time to help people understand what was going on, a lot of it seemed like there was this atmosphere that grew up where or developed that if you didn't understand it, you weren't smart enough to understand it. And that assumption kept growing. That wasn't from the artists. The artists want people to engage, understand, appreciate, and ultimately fall in love with their work. And the great majority of artists are excited to talk about their stuff. But it seems like collectors and gallerists, there was this kind of subtle undercurrent that if you didn't get it right away, you weren't smart. And Clement Greenberg in the 1950s, he proposed this idea that if you don't get it immediately, it's not worth getting, which kind of fed into this fiction that was being developed. We talked about how artists don't ever or very, very, very rarely show what they're seeing. They show what they think about what they're seeing. And a lot of the times, for many of us, we create art that has a one-to-one correspondence with the real world, and that's naturalism, that's realism. But more and more artists are expressing themselves in ways where you get to see inside of their heads and get to see their emotions and their feelings rather than what everybody else can see. And that's what I love about abstraction. It's not intended to separate viewers from the artwork or from the artist. Abstraction is designed so you can get inside their brains, and see what's going on in their thinking. And there, I teach a whole course about how to understand abstraction, and we're not going to go into that quite a bit. But ultimately, I don't want anybody to be afraid of it. And we're gonna see what's going on with some of this. But like last week, we talked about this is a fairly naturalistic, a fairly realistic tree. You can identify it as a tree immediately. We don't need the word tree there because we can tell it's a tree. And yeah, these are kind of fuzzed out. We can almost even say that they're abstracted, but in the context and the overall form, we can still tell they're trees. And we know that this is a branch of another tree. We look at these, the Hudson River School, the first real art genre, or art subdivision developed in the U.S. These are beautiful landscapes that are very naturalistic. I mean, I love this kind of stuff. It's very atmospheric. Um, and I think it's remarkable, but it still is very naturalistic. It's very realistic. You can tell what all the objects are. And then as we start moving into stylization, abstraction means you are simplifying something. And so when something is stylized, it is one of the first forms of abstraction. None of the leaves, these are not naturalistic leaves other than botanical specimens. You're never going to see, or you're very, very rarely going to see, if you ever do, a tree that grows in the wild like this, where it's completely flat. This is more like, pressed botany samples. And there's a reason for this kind of stylization. We still know it's a tree because we're familiar with the elements of a tree, and our brain kind of processes this botanical specimen presentation as we read it as a stylized tree. It's very easy for us to process it that way. Again, with this, the state flag of New Hampshire, it's obvious for most people because of the visual languages we share within our culture. We can tell this is a silhouette of a tree. And it's like a pine tree, or a fir tree. We know what kind of tree it is, even though it's not naturalistic. There's no way you'd ever see this growing in the wild because it's a silhouette. And then we start getting into lettering. And the letters and symbols that most cultures use in their alphabets and in their written language, a lot of them have a history that's shared with naturalistic depictions of things, but they are so simplified over the ages and abstracted to the point where unless you know the context, there's no way of knowing that this is kanji representing tree. And we can see kind of the relationship. We talked about that, the different forms of this kanji to a silhouette of a tree. Yeah, you can kind of see how it's related. But just as with most lettering and most symbols, visual symbols in a language, they become almost non-objective. They almost don't have any roots, and well, they don't have any roots in a recognizable natural world object. That's why it's called non-objective, unless somebody gives you the context or the key. When we get to abstraction like this, where there are areas of color, where we can only identify this as kind of a tree because it's vertical splashes of green. And it kind of reminds you of your memory of out of focus poplars, for example. And my friend who let me use this painting said, yeah, you can say whatever you want about it because ultimately it becomes what people bring to it. And that's the beauty of her work. All of her abstraction is like that, where it's essentially vibrant color fields. And unless somebody tells you this is three trees, you're not going to ever know. And for the viewer, it can be whatever they want it to be, essentially. And then we talked about how this is abstracted to the point where it may have its base in the natural world, but unless you understand what Mondrian is doing, you enjoy it just for being a non-objective grid, essentially. That he parsed everything down to horizontal and vertical lines and only used the primary colors in green for this whole series of paintings that he did. So it is a landscape of a park, but you'd only know that if you know about Mondrian and know what he's doing. Otherwise, it's almost entirely non-objective. And and we talked about the evidence of this, where these are all six landscapes of trees, but by the time you get to these bottom three, I think it feels a lot more obvious to me that Mondrian is sharing his process of trying to simplify the rapidly changing world around him. When he looked out the window, if you went to almost any developed city in Europe and looked out the window, you would see the copper wires of transmission lines for both electricity and the telephone draped on all these ancient buildings, like very much in the looping patterns of these tree limbs. And that's why I'm thinking maybe this is he's influenced by maps of what the city might look like with just the roads. Maybe he's influenced by that kind of, the 1,000 foot view kind of thing of the city he's living in to try to simplify it down. But by the time he gets to this, it feels very non-objective, but it feels like a way of trying to understand the complex world by simplifying it as much as possible. And this is the process where we go from naturalistic trees to abstractions of trees, where we start getting very not almost non-objective. This is still based on a tree because we can associate colors with it. And then we get to this thing where it starts almost becoming sheer geometry. And here, I think you can see very much the abstracted tree getting more and more abstract to the point where there's almost nothing we can hold on to um, and say, yes, that's a tree. And was that a good recap? Does that help to kind of reinforce those ideas of turning something naturalistic or realistic into an abstracted form? And that's something that I wanted to touch on briefly as well in the quizzes that we have. Uh, the instead of I know that some people are still going to Google and looking for definitions on Google. We don't want to do that. Like the seven principles of design are the seven principles of design that are listed in the textbook. And the discussion on what the difference between form and shape is, that is directly out of the textbook as well. A lot of Google searches will give you ideas, give you references where form seems to be synonymous with shape, and that's not the case. If shape is a circle, the form would be a sphere. If shape is a square, the form would be a cube. That is talked about in the textbook. So anyway, back to our regularly scheduled program. So and this is the demo that I did. So there, you get to see the demo a couple times. This is an hour and a half demo, and I think you actually see me carving about halfway through it because I wasn't when I recorded this and posted it, I didn't realize the camera had to be trained on the object for you to be able to see it. So, duh. But I've gotten better since then. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is I just want to look at a couple of the background artists. And I did notice that one of the background artist videos is no longer working, which I thought was kind of funny. I don't know if I mentioned it, I probably did, but like right before getting on here, I double checked and it looked like the link was just fine, and now it's not working. So I've got to find another video to link to for that. Um, which I will take care of. When we're off the call, I'll find another one that we can link to. But I want to talk about the artwork of some of these artists, and just look at some of their stuff, specifically in as regards to their biomorphic abstractions. And again, when we look at that word abstraction, a synonym for that is simplification. And biomorphic abstraction, so an abstraction can be either something drawn from the actual world or something that does not have its base in the actual world. When it does not have its base in the actual world, it is specifically referred to as non-objective abstraction. And the reason why is it doesn't have an object to originate from. Now, whether or not you can see what the original object is for an abstraction, an artist will refer to it as abstract if it's either one of those. But if it is specifically non-objective, then the artist should be referring to it as a non-objective abstract. So I'm hoping that that makes sense. Non-objective covers things like when Wassily Kandinsky painted music. It also covers things when people are using letter forms for their artwork, like calligraphy is particularly non-objective abstraction. We don't think of it that way because it's calligraphy, it's in its own kind of box. But we also, uh, other things that are non-objective would be like color field paintings or energy paintings. When Jackson Pollock would do his dripping, his paint streaks and drips. There's a French artist who will take work and use a jet engine to help him spread the paint. Then Jean-Claude Christo did a lot with covering things with plastic, and that starts getting into conceptual stuff. But I would argue that that could be either abstraction, like simplifying things, like when they create a coastline with plastic, or non-objective, when they're covering something specifically because they want you to go through the process of thinking about what they're hiding. But anyway, and we will talk about that in a couple weeks. But I wanted to look at um, Jean Hans Arp, and I think this is particularly good for this kind of discussion. He was a 2D artist that started concentrating quite a bit in sculpture, and I want you to look at some of his 2D work. I love this kind of stuff when we look at it. Um, Now, okay, can you guys see what I'm the field with the blue and the black shapes?
Yes, we can see
Okay.
it.
All right, excellent. Now, when we look at this shape is, I mean, it's not straight, it doesn't look mechanical. This shape is not straight, it doesn't look mechanical. These curves are not strictly defined by, they don't appear to be defined by a formula. This kind of thing where it looks almost like the artist was feeling it out as they were doing it, that is called an organic line, where it looks like it has life to it. It doesn't look mechanical, it doesn't look completely structured. And this kind of thing where you have a white background that looks, it to me it almost looks like an organ or a cell of some sort. And then these things almost look like amoebas. This is very much an organic biomorphic abstraction. It's abstracted I don't think it's not objective because it feels like to me it is informed by organic elements you'd see in the natural world, like things like a frog's fingertip, structures like that. And but and the line itself is not mechanically derived. And so it feels like to me, like I said, the line is felt out by the artist. That's what we would call an organic line. So, does this make sense to you guys?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna, I want to look at a couple others of his flat stuff. So this is a number, this to me reminds me of the head of a salamander for some reason. This, or this isn't a true mathematically derived oval. It's a very organic kind of oval, as well as this. It has a balance to it, but the balance is a, it's not a mirror balance. The balance seems almost intuitive because of the way that these shapes are put together. Same kind of thing with this. This almost reminds me of like a 1-year-old's or a 2-year-old's drawing of a hand. This makes me think of like a salamander's eye almost. Maybe this is a salamander, this is their eye. And I think stuff like that is just really engaging. Then we look at a couple of his sculptures. Somebody talking, talking, talking. There, right here. This is one of his bronze sculptures. Do you guys remember being in high school biology where they would have like models of things like the human cell or plant cells with chlorophyll and stuff like that? Do you guys remember those kinds of things?
Yeah.
Well,
So
this Does this kind of make you think of that as well?
Okay, yeah, I didn't see that initially when I looked at it, but I can see that now, as you pointed out.
Well, and I love that because these forms, they feel very soft, they feel very flowing, but they don't feel mechanical. It doesn't feel mathematically derived. It feels almost like a little kid playing with clay to just make shapes. It kind of reminds me of the little portions of a human cell or a plant cell, those kinds of things. And I love those kinds of forms. There's no one-to-one correspondence with anything, but it feels like it's informed by it somehow. And I think like this reminds me of, when we were kids and saw pictures of what the genes might look like, kind of thing. Those kind of floppy little bent sausages. And
Mhm.
I really like that. Or these kinds of forms. To me, these kind of make me think of bones on an alien planet, or what would coral look like if it grew, outside of the Earth? What would that be like? Because I it feels like the artist was kind of developing these shapes as they went along. Yes, they're very smooth, they're very polished, but it has that organic kind of quality to it, like the line along the edge of a tooth. And I think that's just amazing. People talking blah blah blah. Same kind of thing here. We get some of that. Maybe there's references to a human body on this one. Maybe there's references to other forms. Maybe there's references to things like earlobes and shoulder blades, but it feels to me more like the artist was just kind of enjoying that kind of freedom of organic shapes. And you see the scale of some of these that he worked on. And then here you were looking at more of these 2D kinds of things, and you can kind of see the relationship of his 2D work to his 3D work. We still got have a lot of these kind of shared silhouettes, but it feels all of them feel like the artist is changing directions as they're building, because that's the way it feels fun to go. you know and there's references to things like starfish, maybe the tiny organelles and little cellular structures, stuff like, I don't know. I think it's kind of fun. There's this free form, organic, flowing quality to it that I think is really, that's what we're thinking about. That's what we're looking at. Oh, and I just tried clicking on a link that is not working. So this is Barbara Hepworth. And I love when she would do stuff in this vein. This organic biomorphic abstraction. Her stuff is just really amazing. It feels, it kind of reminds me of maybe people sitting down, but it's not a person sitting down. It's maybe this is a knee bent. Maybe this is somebody leaning back. And maybe this is something else or somebody else. Maybe this is a dog in the background. Um, but it's not a dog. Maybe it's inspired by some of the movements or forms that you might recognize with a dog. I, I don't think it is meant to be an animal or a person in that particular one we just saw, but I think there's elements there. Now, this one I think is a little bit easier to identify as being directly related to human form. You see the nose and you see the lips, but if that was smoothed out, I think you'd still feel something of that relationship there.
I have a question. I don't mean to get too off topic, and you can give a really simple answer if you want, or not answer it. But what I've noticed as we're studying the different artists, and this artist particularly, I noticed it with her too, is that in I guess that example of the trees that you showed us, it's a common theme I've noticed that artists, as they get more into their art, more mature in their art, it becomes more and more simplified.
I think that might be true for the artists that are interested in doing that. There's a guy named Ivan Albright who started off as a realistic painter. This is about, we're talking maybe 60, 70 years ago. And as he was exploring naturalism, he actually started getting more and more complicated in his work, getting and making tinier and tinier brushes until if you look up Ivan Albright, The Door, that's the name of the painting, The Door. It is a depiction of a door with all these things hanging on it and stuff. But he used his set of brushes were single hair brushes, and he used magnifying glasses in order to paint. So sometimes that's true for the artists that are interested in exploring that, and other artists will go in different routes. The
Okay.
hyper realists definitely did not go the simplification route. But yeah, but it is interesting. I think it's more reflective of what the artist is engaged in doing. They want to explore it more and more. Like Brian Jensen on campus, his place, he was a potter, and then he started exploring sculpture, and he started making these organic mechanical objects like trains and stuff like that with people inside them and everything. And then something he started being really interested in just raw pot forms. And he's made a series of hundreds of these very simple kind of vessels where you enjoy just the simple quality of the vessel. And then he does all these experiments and fun things with the glaze. And the complexity comes with what the glaze looks like. And then he started exploring the conceptuality of pottery. So it's an interesting observation to make because for some artists, it's very true. And for other artists, I think it's reflective of what they become truly fascinated in and want to explore. So I think that's a really good observation. Now, now this, we're looking at this. This almost feels mathematical to me in the structure, except this is not like a mathematical oval. It feels to me like she is doing what you're saying, where she's smoothing it down and simplifying it. You look at earlier works that Barbara Hepworth did, and there's these relatively complicated shapes, and then you find something like this, which is just two flattened spheres, or something like this, where it becomes almost aesthetic in its simplicity, or this, or this. I think that, and I think that in that case, your observation holds out. And I hope you can still see the organic components. Like this line, it's very smooth, it's very regular, but you get these little things like this, these kind of elements in the line where it's not quite mathematical, or you get this oval, but it's a little bit pinched right here, and this center slot is just a little bit off of exact center. And I think that that's really fascinating. So with Barbara Hepworth, maybe what you're saying is holding. I, I I think that you could argue that definitely. And I want to see if we can find Henry Moore is one of my favorite artists. We're going to look at, well, actually, to be completely honest, all these artists that we look at are among my favorites. The ones that really suck, I don't use other than as bad examples. But I mean, can you see, like, particularly in this one, it feels very organic and it is also very abstracted. I don't know if there's a specific one-to-one correspondence anywhere in the natural world, but what is interesting to me is if the people that built Stonehenge wanted to carve an arch out of a single thing, this is kind of makes me think of that. It's not organic in the idea that it mimics a life form, but it's organic, I think, in the role that the human guiding the process is allowing their own humanness to come out, and that the lines aren't mechanical and completely precise. think that's pretty amazing. And so some really interesting stuff. So I don't want to go through the rest of the collection of artists, but other than to say, are you guys really getting the feel for that kind of biomorphic abstraction kind of idea of very organic components? We're not looking at teeth or shoulder blades. What we're looking at is components of organic structure where you can see the irregularity of the artist as they're going through the process of creation. And that's not, somebody said, oh yeah, it shows the imperfection of the human hand. Well, that is absolutely not the case. Do you remember what the word perfect is a synonym for?
Whole or complete?
Exactly. And so when Henry Moore finishes this organic arch form, it is perfect. Now it's not mechanically structured. It is not mathematically ideal, but it does demonstrate beautifully this kind of flow that comes from a human interpreting and deciding where to go using this material that's in front of them. And I think that that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I like that. I I am not very good at graphic design or super fascinated with the AI art, but I feel like everything around that is perfection. But I like with traditional art that it is a little messy. Like I just, like you said, it has the human in it. But I really liked the quote you shared in your video when you were. I actually wrote the meaning of perfection and what you. I have it on a note card now on in front of my computer.
Well, that almost makes me want to cry. That's awesome. That is
I love it.
great.
Yeah, you said it has more to do with honesty than having something look mechanical, and I loved that. And then you said you learn from the process, and if we screw up, we want to pivot and make something new in spite of our screw ups. And I kind of like, I loved that because I was kind of applying it to my life, like outside of art. And I was just like, oh, I love that so much. But I'm going to keep that as a reminder.
Well, thank you
So,
very much. That just made my week. No, but I think as artists, we have this constant struggle because as we're creating, we're learning from the process. And as we're learning from the process, there's a part of us, and sometimes it's a huge part that we can't get around. Part of us wants to go back and fix something so that we can demonstrate what we've learned from the process. And what I think we miss is that these moments of time that we create and calcify into art, they're records of that ongoing process. And I really hope that we don't get so caught up in wanting to demonstrate what we're learning that we disregard those elements that demonstrate what we have learned and what we're learning from. And I say that all because there are artists, and there's a lot of artists that get clinically depressed and just, I mean, super, super depressed because they're so caught up in that cycle. If only I had done this, if only I had done that, or I could do so much better. And instead, when you guys are showing you off your art and people compliment you, I know you are probably the kind of person that will say, "Oh, this was my early work," or, I don't know, I wish I could change this. I don't want you to say that. If somebody is complimenting your work, what they are telling you is that they have good judgment, and you should respect that good judgment, particularly in relation to how they are demonstrating it with what they see that you have done. So when somebody compliments you on your work, all I want you to do is say, "Well, thank you," because they are showing that they are appreciating where you were at the moment that you created that. And I think that as artists, you should remember that at that moment it was absolutely worth something because that informs every subsequent moment and every subsequent thing that you do for the rest of your life. So everything that you do that people see is valuable because it will continually inform everything you do for the next 120 years. So something to remember. So next time somebody compliments you, don't dismiss their compliment. Tell them thank you because you appreciate the fact that they had good enough sense to recognize that you did something worthwhile. Something to remember at least. Okay. I didn't mean to go in that direction, but I did. And I hope it's a good reminder for you guys, especially as we're getting into the midterm. Okay, now here is a link to my brilliant, scintillatingly brilliant demonstration of the process. As we go through this, I do want you to watch that and look at these links because these links talk about this biomorphic form, this organic abstraction. And I use a lot of these names, I jumble them together quite a bit. But there's tutorial videos. This doesn't always deal with foam. Some of it is foam, some of it is balsa wood. Like this is a balsa wood carving, but it all comes down to ultimately these kinds of forms. And I really like this because I think on this you can kind of see some of that Jean Hans Arp, that work. And this, I hope you can kind of see some of that. Um, oh, I forget her name, Barbara Hepworth. And on this one, I hope you can kind of see some of that stuff by Henry Moore. You know, this is almost feels to me like it's a kneeling figure, and I think the person did it beautifully. And this very definitely reminds me of Jean Hansarp. I think it's pretty cool stuff. So you know, if I'm really hoping that you guys get these ideas because what is fun to me about biomorphic abstraction is that if you feel you've screwed up, 9 times out of 10, you're going to be the only one who knows that. If something goes not exactly right, it's not the direction you want, smooth it over, smooth it in, make it look like it's part of the thing, and just go on, and nobody will know. Okay, so I'm going to. All right. Now I am going to share, and I know, Liv, if you are able to type stuff in, that's great. But if we make any comments, Kelsey, since your microphone is working, um, you'll probably be the one to do that. We don't have to comment on everyone unless you see something that really sticks out to you. I do want to, last week you said you were working on production, and is that true?
Oh, for me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, myself and my kids were in the SpongeBob musical with Bluffdale City,
Oh, very
and
cool.
we're doing our performances now. So it was all last week and this week. So we had a performance Monday, and now we have one Thursday, Friday, and we have two more on Saturday.
All right,
So
excellent. Very cool.
anyone in the area is welcome to come. It's very goofy, but it's been a lot of my time, and I don't know if I'll do it again during a semester, but it's been fun.
I I really enjoy SpongeBob. It is one of the most intellectual cartoons out there, believe it or not. I mean, it's all goofy and everything like that, but
Yeah,
it is incredibly culturally relevant and it is very self-critical. Not in a nasty way, but in the same way that we're talking about, the tools of artistic critique, where it identifies things, it describes them, it talks about them, and it talks about its place in the society, but it all does it all under thinly veiled humor, which I think is absolutely hilarious. So
yeah.
I love Squidward being the perfect example of modern passive aggressiveness.
Oh yeah. It's pretty
But I
great.
just and I love the fact that um, You can you can explore this further if anybody wants to. I hope you don't, though. That Patrick is the Aaron to SpongeBob's Moses, and I think that is fantastic.
Oh,
And
interesting. I thought of it like that.
Sandy Sandy is the Peter to the SpongeBob's Messiah, which I think is fascinating too. In the same way that in RoboCop, Officer Murphy is Peter and Mary to RoboCop's Jesus, which I think is fascinating.
Nice.
If anybody wants to watch RoboCop again, Paul Verhoeven very specifically did a retelling of the New Testament as if Jesus came with a gun instead of a sword. So I'm just putting that out there. All
I love
right.
that.
So back to the regularly scheduled program. Let's see if we can get this. I'm going to try to share this. Let me know if it works. Okay. You should see a form, an image on there that looks kind of like almost like beads growing together on a
It looks like
string.
teether
Yeah, like a
to me.
teether. That's excellent. Okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, good. All right, now what I'm going to be looking at and what I'm going to be talking about as we go from object to object is how these things fit in with the parameters of the assignment. And what we want to do in this assignment is take that block, and it's two pieces of foam that are glued together. That's your block. And we want to make an organic biomorphic abstracted form. So there's not going to ever be a one-to-one correspondence. We're not making a starfish. We're not making a puppy dog. Nothing like that. We don't want to recognize it. What we are doing, though, is drawing from natural forms that we encounter and elements, portions of those natural forms. So one thing I really like about this is we can't see any of the flat surfaces of that original block. None of them. I also like how the person has made it. Now, if you can imagine, this would look really good if the top part was the bottom, or if it stood up on this part right here. I don't think this is a very flattering presentation of it because it's flat. It's not very interesting. But it does engage three-dimensional space if you can imagine it resting on these two bulbs. I love the fact that this is almost perfectly spherical, this one on the bottom right. The next one to it looks like an egg almost. Next one up doesn't have quite the same orientation. It's flopping down a little bit. The next one up seems to be flopping up and towards us a little bit. So they aren't all sharing identical orientations. It does all spiral out from a center point, but that doesn't particularly bother me because of how much effort they've spent on rounding these forms and making them their own things. Now, we are going to be applying paper mache to this later on. So we want the sand to get rid of the tool marks and make it as smooth as possible. But you can see this area right here, I'll blow it up. This is evidence of the tool use and what the foam does if you sand it with a heavier grit sandpaper. That's not necessarily a bad thing because that is something that we'll be able to cover up when we do the paper mache process. But things like this is an evident tool mark right here. We want to get as many of those tool marks gone as we can. This where it's not smoothly going from one part to another, that may not be bothersome if that's a texture. And if hopefully you can see this change of direction right there where it's kind of smooth, but you do see a definite change in direction of the surface. If that kind of thing was consistent in several areas, that would not be bothersome. But if everything was completely smooth like this and you had one nodule like that, then that would be a sign that you need to smooth it down a little bit so it matched everything else. So I'm hoping that that kind of is making a little bit of sense. Now, if either of you want to comment or anything on it, um, I'm not able to see right away as we're exploring this, so please say something. Now, on this one, the thing that bothers me is you can see this is obviously the flat surface of the original block. That bothers me. The tool mark here and the roughness there shows me that they didn't sand it down really well. I mean, particularly in connection with this area is well sanded, this area on the bottom left is well sanded. So that becomes kind of a concern. And if the sandpaper is really rough, you should have a couple different grits of sandpaper. Use a finer grit sandpaper, and that will help. Right through here, we see the tool mark right there. That can be solved by sanding this out a little bit. The things that I do really like is you can see how smooth that is. This bellies out very cleanly, and it looks it's not a mechanical or mathematically derived oval. It feels organic. I like that. We can see how this scoops along the bottom. This area feels like it's a little bit closer to us than this because of this strong delineation right there, where they carved this down and made this surface very different than this surface. I hope you guys can see that. I'm liking how it's smooth right here, and then it's smooth. It has a little bit of a change of direction here, and that change of direction is repeated here and here. That doesn't bother me. Now, if everything was totally smooth and then we see that change of direction there, that would start being a concern because it would look to me like the person wasn't finished sanding it down. Is this making sense to everybody?
Yes.
Okay. All right, what I really like about this is that silhouette is delightful. It reads like right out of the Jean Van Han Arp's stuff, what he was doing. But we are not making silhouettes. We're making a three-dimensional sculpture. So can you see the flat of the original surface of the block on this one? What
Yeah.
types of things do you think this person could do that would help to eliminate that?
Um, Maybe if they made it smaller and rounder, I think it would look more like a tooth at that point. But because I remember when we were studying this, it said that the piece you start out with has to be significantly larger than your finished product. And so I think where this artist went wrong is they didn't make it small enough, I guess. Is
Well,
that
no,
right?
no, I'm that is if that's what you got out of it, that's a complete miscommunication on my part because I want
Oh,
you to use as much of the foam block as you possibly can. It is going to
okay.
be significantly smaller just because of the process of carving. But on this one, I don't think they'd need to make it smaller. What I was thinking is, because I don't want you to make it smaller if you can avoid it, but because this plane is so much the same as that original surface of the block, I would say rounding this. We have this kind of harsh edge on the edge, round it down so that these feel almost cylindrical with little knot bulbs at the end. And maybe these, instead of making them so square, maybe round them as well. And we could even maybe cut an inch into this one from the front side, an inch into this one from the back side. So when we look at it as we're going around, it almost looks like this is folding away and this is folding towards us. So those does that kind of make sense what I'm talking about? So we don't
Yeah,
necessarily we want it as big as we can out of that block, but just the nature of carving, it's going to be smaller just because you're cutting stuff away.
right. I'm so glad you clarified that.
Yeah, because it's going to be if you can keep it as big as possible, that's going to give you a lot more freedom to give it texture, to round elements and stuff like that. So I am really happy you said that. Now this one, I think this is a good example where, you can see the principal form of the block, but this would work. And this would work. All they would have to do is get rid of this surface. This is a very flat surface. And the easiest way to do that is by rounding this, sand it so that instead of this surface coming flat, going down and then scooping back, round this whole thing. So it feels more like the edge of a hand rather than the edge of a cliff. Does that make sense? You know,
Yeah.
it,
That's
And
an
like,
easy fix.
yeah, it's an easy fix. And I don't think it would take much like this. I think on this area in the top right, I would scoop that out even more and then
Yeah.
round this out quite a bit, maybe scoop this in a little bit so that the surface comes out, goes in, goes out again. And then rounding this top could look more like a squishy egg almost. Then it would, you'd have a fold right here, you'd have a fold right there as it comes out. And we're going to look at another one that is almost identical, but the person did think of it as fleshy folds kind of thing. Like, my belly when I lean over.
Is that this one?
More information than anybody needs. But yes, this is that one where you can see the relationship between these two.
Okay.
This is the shape of the block right there. But can you feel how rounded this is? And you can
Yeah.
see, I mean, it feels to me very obvious that this is much more rounded. And
Okay.
so this is a smoother application of those tools. Now this person, they had actually taken photos, but when they went to turn them in, somebody had helpfully erased them for them. So we just see what it looked like um, after they covered it with paper mache. But this is a good window into your futures in a month or so when you do the paper mache. There is one coating of paper mache, it's sanded off, made smooth, a second coating, and then that's sanded smooth as well. But you can see the paper mache will cover some of those areas where you're sanding it and the foam keeps coming out. So your foam doesn't need to be perfectly smooth, but it does need to be smooth enough that the paper mache can adhere to it. And this, I hope you can really see how that the foam has been carved so that it's smooth. And by the time it gets to this, the foam underneath almost feels like a squishy balloon because of how they carved it and smoothed it out.
So I haven't completely finished your tutorial video. I'm almost all the way done, but I'm where you're mixing up the glue for the paper mache. So that one you just showed us, is that what you want the final to look like with just the newspaper, or should we paint over the newspaper?
For the paper mache assignment, it will just be the paper mache. Then for your final portion of at the end of the semester, you're going to be adding color and texture to it.
Oh, so is the paper mache different than this? Like we submit it looking like this one we're seeing now
Right,
first?
you submit with just the foam, and then in 2 weeks you'll
Okay.
be asked to cover it with paper mache.
Oh, okay, cool.
So
Thanks.
that video, that's the whole process, but I only want you to worry about it until I show you how it should look after it's sanded and everything.
Oh, okay, good to know.
So, yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you for bringing that up. Now on this one, I mean, this looks really good form-wise. You can see that things are curved, and it's not all smooth, elegant curves like a perfectly manicured egg. You get these very organic structures where it almost looks like it's folding a little bit, almost looks kind of bone-like, and that's all fine. What I would hope that this person would do to kind of uh, or to finish it off would be like right in here, we can see a lot of tool marks. I don't know how you can sand this out other than getting finer grit sandpaper and kind of crushing it around your finger and using that to kind of smooth the inside out. Maybe doing that on each of these holes too, so we don't see those tool marks. And right here, can you see these vertical tool marks as well? Those aren't quite sanded away. They need to be sanded down a bit right through here. I think this would benefit from sanding this and making this a little bit smoother. I don't mind it so much right here, but I do feel that there needs to be a little bit of a transition. And here I do feel that this area, some of it is flat, just like that original surface of the block. But right here, where you see those tool marks, get rid of the tool marks as much as you can. I love the shape itself. I think it's a beautiful expression of that biomorphic abstraction, those organic qualities that we're talking about. Now, this I think is fantastic. This is amazing to me. This one. It's a very simple form. We don't have a lot going on. but it feels very organic. It feels like polished bone, like a Henry Moore kind of structure. And the person who sanded it within, an eighth of an inch of its life. It is really, really nicely sanded. I don't expect anybody to get it that smooth. That doesn't seem quite human to me to be able to get it that smooth, but they did a really nice job sanding it. And this is what I'm talking about, where we don't see any tool marks. We don't want to see tool marks, but the surface is clean and the surface looks like it's ready to be paper mache. Now this one, I love this form. I love the tube right here, this torus kind of ring, where it feels more like a misshapen or Cheerio. It is not a perfect ring. It feels organic. It feels like it's made by a human being. I love this little nodule down here, this thing hanging off over there. It I know that they carved it out of the block, but we can't see any surface remaining of that original block. What this person does need to work on, I feel, is they need to sand it more and make it more smooth. And I say that in particular, this area is sanded pretty well. But we look at the rest of it, and it feels like maybe they used too heavy a grit of sandpaper. Maybe use the finer grit sandpaper to work on this a little bit. And if it's just not working, then stop. And if I grade you down for it, tell me, hey, this is the best I could do. I will fill in the rest of this with the goop when I do the paper mache. Okay, I can live with that because we are limited by the tools that we have too. Now, right here though, I'm thinking these areas right here, that could stand a little bit more sanding. And I think so. I say that there has to be grace provided for tool use. What are the restrictions of the tools that we're using? If we look at paintings of Madonna and Child from the 13th century compared to 200 years later, the biggest difference is between them. I mean, aside from the poses and things like that, is we can see that they were painting with tempera, which dries very rapidly. And then during the Renaissance, they painted with oils. And the difference is oil paints, you can keep allows for manipulation of shading and smoothness in shading. And so that's one of the reasons why we see Byzantine painting with very harsh, relatively harsh lines, and Renaissance painting with relatively smooth lines in the shading. A big part of that was because of the difference in materials that were used. So, we do need to take that into account. But anyway, this I think is another beautiful example. I think we can see the organic forms are very obvious. Even this, we have a little bit of a harsher edge, but it feels more like the edge that you'd see on like a scapula or something. It doesn't feel like a mechanically precise or mathematical edge. And I love that. I like how it's scooped out and it's irregular. It's very interesting. I love how these nodules feel organic and smooth. And you do get a little bit of that harsh change in direction, but they're doing it right here. 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 In this case, it feels intentional. It doesn't feel like they gave up on sanding. Do you kind of see what I'm saying, what the difference is? Okay. Yeah, I love this form. When they go to display this, I would stick skewers right through here and use this as the bottom, and this would be fantastic. Now, this one I think has a lot of promise, and there are different things that I would do to this one. The first thing I would do is that this feels a little bit blocky because it feels like they haven't done an awful lot. It feels like this is a silhouette cut out of the block and then the surface was just textured. To make this feel more finished, I would start sanding and carving this so that these forms that come out of that center, it's like a cinnamon roll right now, but these forms that come out, I would turn them more into almost like fins. And maybe on like this structure right here, I would sand down this so that it feels like it's pointing that way. And maybe on this one, next one, I would sand this away and, do the undercuts even deeper so that it feels like this is pointing that way. And I would alternate back and forth like that. Because even if you're carving, you could still make it feel like the direction is changing. And I would go in a lot deeper with these grooves to the point where maybe some of them go almost all the way through. Maybe right in the middle, it does go all the way through. But then we have completely removed that exterior surface of the original block, yes, but it still feels very much like it's constrained by that original block. And I think the person needs to carve in deeper in some of those areas. Is that making sense to you? Is
Yeah.
that okay? I was afraid that you were nodding because you just wanted me to shut up and continue. But is
No,
this
no.
okay?
It was just to be like, yeah, I get it.
All right. Now, this is another really beautiful example. And this one, it's hard to find the original block. This passage right here feels a little bit too flat. I think that elements could be rounded a lot more with the sandpaper, but I love how these forms, it almost feels like this was made out of clay and they wiggled those different nodules in different directions because of the way they carved it. And I think that they did that really well. I think this is another beautiful example. This reminds me of some of the body horror anime where like the person starts morphing into something and all these uh, protrusions start growing out of the villain or whatever. But I really like this. It's almost like a stack of um, mushrooms or something. It's really kind of fun. But I love how this person carved it so that it feels like like these nodules are flopping towards us. This nodule is flopping towards us. And then you get up here, these nodules seem to be flopping away from us. And the person did a really good job of sanding. I still see a few tool marks, but for the most part, they did a really nice job of sanding. There's still a lot of texture to it, but that texture is a result of the sanding. It's not because they got lazy. Are, are you seeing this? And that texture is slight enough that we can definitely tamp it down and fill it up when we apply the paper mache in the next step. So this is a really, really good example. And this one I think is a really good example of the person starting and I want to see what they do in the next 2 hours because this is so close to being ideal. I, the silhouette is very fun, very cool. But right here, I think all they need to do is sand this so we don't see that flat surface anymore. Make this feel like an organic egg. Make this feel like an organic softball by sanding it as well, making it smooth. And then right here, the reason I don't like this edge is because it feels like, we can still see, it doesn't feel like we can still see that original side of the block. But to get rid of that, instead of stopping, this person needs to sand more. Sand more. Get maybe even scoop out the inside a little bit so that the surface rounds up here and then goes down in. And maybe that going down in, that scooping out, then you can kind of connect it with this hole right here. Maybe this is a little bit more spindly right through here. Maybe this area, you just sand it just barely enough around here so that this feels like a return to this kind of egg shape with this little nodule sticking out. And doing the same kind of thing here, where it almost feels like one of those uh, they if you go on if you go to like a coastal city or to Hawaii, they make shells necklaces, and the shells are little short things that look almost like beans. That makes me or this shape makes me think of those things. Or maybe this is a bean shape, and just by rounding it out and smoothing it out like Jean Han Arps did, would give it that shape. But this is something that is almost there. It just needs rounding and sanding. I really love this form. I think this is great. this is an example of, maybe this is because of the sanding with the heavy grit sandpaper. Maybe that's what that caused there. What does concern me is that this edge feels a little bit sharp. This edge I don't have a problem with. We can see there is a dramatic change in direction, but it does feel like it's intentionally done that way. This feels like they cut it out and just kind of left it. And I think one of the reasons why I have a problem with that is on both, you can see the definite tool marks here where they did just cut it out and leave it. And I think that this needs to be, the tool marks need to be sanded down and that edge needs to be smoothed just enough so we know it's intentional, like this one. I love how the carving right here makes it feel like this is a fat tortilla that's folded over. I think that that's great. I love these different kind of forms looking like they're glued next to each other. And in some areas they kind of blend one into another, and in other areas they look like they're just squished in there. And I think that this is another really good example that I think just needs a little bit of tweaking with the sanding. This one I think is an excellent example, again, like that one we saw just a couple ago, where the person has a beautiful idea for a silhouette, but I think more needs to happen. We still see that flat edge there. And it's not a matter of just rounding this off, maybe thinking about maybe cutting an inch away, down from this front edge and repeating that internal line structure there so that it feels like this is bending away from us. Doing the same thing with this one. Maybe on this one, going down deep in here, but kind of tapering up and leaving this almost to that edge and then cutting down the back. So we get a feel that these two portions are flopping away from this and this is leaning towards us. Rounding this off and then seeing where that rounding goes. Maybe this area right down here needs to recede quite a bit, or maybe this needs to be like a skinny egg shape supporting it. And this needs to come forward a bit. Maybe the skinny egg shape needs to be on top of a fatter torus right here. So, but this more sanding. So all of these shapes I think are beautifully designed. Now this one I think is elegant and simple, like a couple of the others that we've seen, but I think it's beautifully done. If the person wanted to do any more, maybe a little bit more sanding to make it more smooth, maybe making carving this down a little bit so that this edge is more pronounced and then comes down in, not edge, but this form is more pronounced because it comes down in right here. And that would help to make both of these stand out a little bit more. But I think this is a beautiful example of, again, a simple form where they're really paying attention to that biomorphic abstraction. This one I think is really interesting. I like that center torus again, where it's not a completely perfect donut, but it has that kind of feeling of a sloppy Cheerio ring. And this shape is really interesting. I'd like more sanding because I can still really obviously see the tool marks. And I think more sanding is in order. And this feels almost a little bit too regular, but I would play around, if for this person, I would play around more with the sanding and get rid of those tool marks and see where that takes you and if that inspires any further manipulation. And then we're back at the beginning. So what does that help going through and seeing all those and talking about each one like that?
Yeah. Do you have any advice for us on picking our shapes? Like coming up with inspiration on what to. I think I already know what I want to do, but I thought I'd ask in case any other students were struggling.
Well, going through the background things, looking at what like Henry Moore did and stuff like that, that's really good. But I would suggest something, and I think I talked about this last week. Get printer paper, tear it up into strips, tear those into chunks, put it in a Ziploc bag and soak it in water overnight. And do not put this down the drain. Don't ever put it down the drain because it will clog and make your roommates totally pissed at you or other family members. So you take that, I would probably do that with 2 or 3 sheets of paper, and you'll get this thing that looks like a spitball about that big. And then I would just take that and with your hand in the bag, so it's still wet, just start squishing it and seeing what that looks like. And if you start getting forms that you like, maybe pull it out of the bag and squish it and manipulate it like clay, but see what the inside of your hands look like as those shapes are impressed onto that paper clay that you've just made. And if you want this to be something that you can air dry and keep, I would drain out most of the water and then squish a bunch of Elmer's glue in it. Probably wear gloves when you work on it because getting the glue off those tiny little fine hairs on the back of your hands and fingers, it hurts. But um, putting about half a bottle of glue in there, white glue in there, and mixing it up again can make it so that it will dry and you can actually preserve it and keep it as a reference. But just squish it with your hands, play with that, see if there's any forms that you like, pull that out, maybe use your hands to start thinking about the roots of teeth and bones and coral, different shapes like that. Or um, if you guys have like go to the Dollar Tree and get some of those plastic succulent plants and look at those. Maybe cut them apart and play with the leaves on, those fat, fleshy leaves and play with that and see what those that inspires. And I think what is really hard is the problem is that most artists are really intelligent and you guys have a really hard time stepping away from contextualizing whatever it is you see. So if you find plant elements or bone elements or things like that, you're going to automatically contextualize it. This forms into a finger or this connects to something else. When you see yourself doing that, try to stop yourself from doing that and just try to see if you can enjoy the form and the shape of these elements that you're looking at, separate from their context. And I'm not asking you to dumb yourself down. I'm just asking yourself to try that exercise of taking it out of the form context that you're going to automatically put it into. And I think that those two things are going to help you come up with ideas. Now, one of the things that Jason did a couple years ago was have everybody make 3 little sculptures like that, and then have somebody else in the class pick which one they were going to carve. I I'm a little bit nicer than that. I think that's really mean. But play with those things. Don't make a sculpture that you're going to put into the foam. What you're doing is finding elements of form that you think might be fun to put together into that foam sculpture. Does that make does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Excellent. All right, well that brings us pretty much to the end of this week's session. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you very much for staying awake if you chose to. And do you guys have any final observations? Well, Liv, as we've been going through this and looking at it, is this making a lot of sense to you? Is it making more sense than going trying to go through and read the assignment? All right, excellent. Now I'm um, and Liv just stepped out, but I want you guys to consider this, think about it, use your imagination, and try really hard to think about these forms outside of their natural context. And I think that that will help quite a bit. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me. And I look forward to seeing you guys next week.
All right. Thank you.
All right. We'll see you.
Bye.